Captain Oakes slammed his palm flat on the briefing table and pointed directly at Sergeant Elena Cruz. "Get her out of my ops room," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I will not have a radio girl telling me how to run a combat convoy." He laughed, and the men around him laughed with him, and Elena stood there holding her map with both hands, while every pair of eyes in that room looked straight through her like she was made of smoke. 480 Marines were about to walk into Carsa Basin, and not one of them knew they were already dead, if not for her. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Elena Cruz arrived at Forward Operating Base Alvarado Valley, the temperature was already climbing past 90, and the wind tasted like chalk. She carried her rucksack over one shoulder, her communications equipment case in her other hand, and a folded topographical map tucked inside her left boot, because she had learned a long time ago that paper had a way of disappearing in places where nobody wanted you to know the terrain. She had been transferred from Camp Pendleton with no explanation beyond a 3-line order in the name of a captain she had never met. His name was Captain Derek Oakes, and she learned everything she needed to know about him in the first 90 seconds of their introduction. He was standing outside the motor pool when she walked up and rendered a proper salute. He looked at her hand, then at her face, then back at her hand, and finally returned the salute with the slow, deliberate energy of a man who considered the gesture beneath him. "Cruz," he said. "Yes, sir." "You're the comms specialist they sent me." "Yes, sir." He looked at the equipment case, then at her rank, then at her face again. "How long have you been in?" "7 years, sir." He made a sound at the back of his throat that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a dismissal. It was something worse than both. It was indifference dressed up as amusement. 7 years, he repeated like the number itself was the punchline. "All right, Sergeant Holloway will show you to your billet. Stay out of the ops room until I call for you." He turned and walked away before she could respond. Sergeant First Class Danny Holloway was a broad-shouldered man from rural Georgia who wore his kindness quietly and his loyalty openly. He fell into step beside Elena and picked up her rucksack without being asked. She tried to take it back. He didn't let her. "Don't take it personal," he said. "I don't," she said. "He does that with everybody new. He does it more with some people than others." Holloway was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "he does." Elena had spent 7 years learning not to flinch at rooms that went quiet when she walked in at briefings, where her input was requested, and then ignored at after-action reports, where her contributions were credited to the man standing next to her. She had grown a particular kind of patience, not the passive kind, the coiled kind, the kind that waits because it knows its moment is coming. She set up her equipment in the comms tent and spent the first 3 days doing her job better than anyone at FOB Alvarado Valley had seen it done. She ran tight radio checks across all frequencies, mapped out dead zones in the valley caused by the ridgeline interference, and filed a detailed communications gap report that Holloway read twice and passed up to Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, the battalion commander, who acknowledged it with a brief nod and no follow-up. On the 4th day, she found the maps. They were standard-issue topographic charts of Carsa Basin pinned to a board in the corner of the operations tent that nobody seemed to be looking at very hard. She stood in front of them for 45 minutes. She pulled out the map from her boot. She compared them side by side. Carsa Basin was a long, narrow corridor carved between 2 ridgelines. The eastern ridge rose sharply, almost vertically in sections, with a series of natural shelf formations at roughly 200 and 300 meters elevation. The western ridge was more gradual, but offered extended sight lines along the valley floor. The road that cut through the basin, the road that would be used by the Operation Clearview convoy, ran almost perfectly straight for 0.6 of a mile before curving hard around a rock formation that the maps labeled as Reference Point Delta. She had studied ambush geography for 3 years under a master sergeant named Delgado, who had spent 2 tours in Fallujah and could read a piece of terrain the way other people read a newspaper. He had taught her to look for choke points, elevated firing positions, natural cover concentrations, and limited egress routes. He had taught her that an ambush wasn't just a tactical decision, it was a geographical one. The land itself made certain places dangerous. Carsa Basin, as she stood looking at those maps, was the most dangerous piece of geography she had ever seen outside of a textbook. She went to Captain Oakes that same afternoon. He was in the ops room with his executive officer, Lieutenant Ferris, and two platoon commanders when she knocked on the frame and asked for a moment. Oakes turned around with the expression of a man who had been interrupted during something important by someone who had no business interrupting anything. "What is it, Cruz, sir? I've been looking at the route maps for Clearview. I have some concerns about the terrain profile in Carsa Basin that I think warrant a discussion before the convoy brief." Ferris exchanged a look with one of the platoon commanders. It was a quick look, the kind people make when they've already decided something and someone keeps trying to reopen the question. Oakes leaned back in his chair. "Concerns?" "Yes, sir. The eastern ridgeline has multiple natural shelf formations that would provide stable elevated firing positions with direct sight lines onto reference point Delta. The road geometry at that point creates a natural choke point. If enemy forces were positioned on those shelves, the convoy would have extremely limited room to maneuver and almost no cover." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Ferris said, "How long have you been a comms specialist, Sergeant?" 7 years, sir." "And in that time, how many combat operations have you planned?" She didn't answer right away because the question wasn't really a question. It was a door being closed in her face. "Sergeant Cruz," Oakes said, his voice carrying a kind of exaggerated patience, "I appreciate that you've been spending time with the maps. That's diligent. But the route for Clearview has been assessed by the Battalion S2 and cleared by the regimental intelligence officer. We've had surveillance drones over that basin for 72 hours with no activity signatures. Drones can miss static positions, sir. If the fighters are already in place and holding, they wouldn't generate thermal signatures significant enough to cruise." His voice sharpened. Just her name, but the way he said it left no space for anything that followed. "You're a communications specialist. You make sure we can talk to each other. That's your job. The route planning is not your job. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now, let me get back to my brief." She walked out of the ops room and stood in the dust outside with the flat heat pressing down on her from every direction. She breathed in. She breathed out. She did not let her hands shake. Holloway found her there 20 minutes later. He didn't ask what happened. He had heard enough through the open flap to know. "He's not going to listen," he said. "I know." "What are you going to do?" She looked at him for a long moment. Holloway was one of the few people on this base who had ever asked her that question and actually wanted the real answer. "I don't know yet," she said, which wasn't entirely true. She had an idea. She just hadn't decided whether she was willing to pay for it. That night, she pulled out a piece of blank paper and wrote down everything she remembered from the 7 months she had spent as a volunteer member of the Scout Sniper training program at Pendleton before the program coordinator, a major named Reyes, had quietly removed her name from the roster without explanation. She had never been told why. She had never asked. She had simply absorbed everything she could in the time she was given and filed it away like ammunition she might need someday. Wind estimation, elevation adjustment, breathing patterns, shot sequencing under stress, target prioritization in a complex contact environment. She wrote it all down not because she had forgotten any of it, but because writing it made it feel real in a way that was different from memory. Writing it made it a plan. She was on page 3 when Holloway ducked into her tent. "Convoy brief is tomorrow morning," he said. "Oh, 700. Captain wants full comms team present." "I'll be there." He looked at the paper on her cot. "Elena," she looked up. "Whatever you're thinking," he said carefully, "I need you to know that I'm not going to pretend I don't notice. And I need you to know that if something goes wrong, I can't cover for you. I'm not asking you to. I know, I'm just—" He stopped, started again. 480 Marines, Elena. "I know, Danny. I'm going to say this once, and then I'm going to leave. You are the most competent person on this base. I've known that since the first day you got here. And I've watched this base be completely unwilling to use you, and I've watched you swallow it every single day." He paused. "Whatever you're thinking about, whatever plan is forming in your head right now, I think you're probably right." He left before she could respond. She lay back on her cot and stared at the canvas above her and thought about Captain Oakes's face when he'd said her name like a period at the end of a sentence. She thought about the eastern ridgeline. She thought about the road geometry at reference point Delta. She thought about the convoy, 480 men and women, rifles loaded, eyes forward, moving in a straight line through the most indefensible terrain in the entire operational area. And she thought about what happened to convoys that walked into prepared ambush positions without overwatch. She knew what happened. She had read every after-action report from every convoy ambush in the theater for the past 3 years. She had read them because Sergeant Delgado had told her to. He had said you need to understand failure before you can prevent it. And she had understood. She had understood better than anyone who had dismissed her in that ops room. The convoy brief the next morning was exactly what she had expected. The ops room was packed. Platoon commanders, squad leaders, vehicle commanders, logistics personnel. Oakes stood at the front with a laser pointer and walked through the route with the confidence of a man who had made peace with his assumptions. He covered the timeline, the radio frequencies, the medical evacuation plan. The rules of engagement. He did not mention the Eastern Ridgeline. He did not mention reference point Delta as a potential choke point. Elena sat in the second row and kept her expression neutral. When Oakes opened the floor for questions, 2 squad leaders asked about communication protocols in the dead zones she had already identified. She answered both questions clearly and precisely, and Oakes acknowledged her answers without making eye contact. Then Corporal Hayes, 22 years old, 3 months in country, a rifleman from Phoenix who reminded Elena of her younger brother, raised his hand and asked why the convoy wasn't going to use the northern bypass route. Oakes looked at him. The northern bypass adds 4 hours to the mission timeline. We're on a tight operational window. But sir, isn't the basin route going to funnel us pretty tight around that rock formation before Delta? My squad leader told me that. Your squad leader, Oakes said, cutting him off with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, is not the convoy commander. I am. The route has been cleared and approved. Any other questions? Reyes sat down. He glanced at Elena on the way down, and she saw something in his face, not fear exactly, but a premonition. Young soldiers sometimes had that. They hadn't yet learned how to rationalize danger away the way experienced soldiers did. After the brief, when the room was clearing, Ferris stopped beside Elena's chair. He waited until most people had filed out, then looked down at her with an expression that might have been curiosity if it hadn't been so cautious. You kept quiet in there, he said. You all kept me pretty quiet yesterday, sir. He absorbed that. Look, Cruz. He stopped. Tried again. The captain is a good officer. He's run 3 successful convoy operations through this AO in the last 60 days. I know, sir. He knows this terrain. I know he believes that, sir. Ferris stared at her. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of something he wasn't willing to fully acknowledge. Then he straightened up, put his cover back on, and walked out. Elena sat alone in the ops room for a long time after that. She pulled the topographic map out of her boot and spread it across the empty table. She traced the convoy route with her finger. She measured distances with her knuckle. She found the eastern shelf formations again and calculated approximate angles of fire from each position down to the road surface. Then she did something that would either save 480 lives or end her career. She went back to her billet, opened her personal gear bag, and began pulling out the equipment she had brought with her from Pendleton, equipment that had no official reason to be their equipment. She had signed for through channels that were not exactly irregular, but were not exactly transparent either. A Remington 700.308 Winchester mounted with a Leupold Mark IV scope, a spotting scope, 400 rounds of match-grade ammunition in sealed boxes. A ghillie suit she had built herself over 6 months, adding and trimming and testing until it fit the visual signature of dry, high-desert scrub. She laid everything on her cot and looked at it. Holloway appeared in the tent flap. He looked at the gear. He looked at her. A long silence passed between them. You're going to be court-martialed, he said. Probably. Or killed. Possibly. Elena, his voice dropped. Tell me why. Tell me why you're certain enough to do this. She looked at the map and then back at him. Because I know what those shelf formations look like when fighters are holding position in them. I've studied it, Danny. I've looked at satellite imagery from ambush sites in this theater for 2 years. The pattern matches. The geometry matches. And the captain doesn't know it because he's never looked at this basin the way I've looked at it. She paused. If I'm wrong, I get court-martialed and the convoy makes it through and I deserve everything they give me. But if I'm right and I do nothing, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Holloway looked at the rifle on her cot, then at her face. What do you need from me? Nothing. I need nothing from you. I need you to be as far away from this as possible when it comes out. That's not what I asked. She looked at him for a long time. The eastern ridge has three approach routes. The middle one, the drainage channel that runs behind the motor pool and up toward the limestone shelf at grid 274, it's not on any official movement log. Nobody runs patrols up there because it's outside the base perimeter boundary. He didn't say anything, but she watched his face and understood what his silence meant. She began packing her gear before dawn. She moved through the base with the quiet of someone who had learned over 7 years how to be invisible in plain sight. Past the motor pool, past the fuel depot, through the wire at a gap she had identified on her third day where a sandstorm had displaced 2 pickets and the base engineers had not yet gotten around to fixing them. And then the darkness swallowed her whole and she was moving up the slope of the eastern ridge alone in full gear, carrying 400 rounds of match-grade ammunition and the weight of a certainty that no one else on this base shared. The convoy was scheduled to depart at 0900 hours. She had 6 hours. She used all of them. By the time pale light began working its way along the ridge tops, Elena Cruz had covered 1,100 meters of elevation gain through loose shale and dry brush. She had crossed 2 drainage channels, navigated a goat trail that switched back across the face of the limestone shelf, and settled into a natural depression in the rock at approximately 340 meters of elevation, a position that gave her a full, unobstructed sight line down the length of the basin road, including the entire approach to reference point Delta. She calibrated her scope in the gray pre-dawn light. She checked wind direction with a wet finger and confirmed it with a small piece of thread tied to a rock beside her. She ranged every significant feature of the road below her, using the mil-dot reticle in her scope, and recorded each distance in a small notebook with a grease pencil. She laid out her ammunition in organized rows, not because she expected to use all of it, but because a sniper who reaches for her magazine and finds it empty in the middle of a firefight has made a fatal error that no amount of skill can reverse. Then she waited. The sun came up hard and fast the way it always did in the high desert, burning the cool out of the air within 30 minutes of clearing the ridge. She didn't move. She didn't shift. She barely blinked. The ghillie suit pressed against her back and the limestone pressed against her chest, and she became, for all practical purposes, a feature of the landscape, a slightly irregular patch of dry vegetation on a rocky shelf that no one looking up from the valley floor would look at twice. She had her radio on its lowest volume setting tuned to the battalion convoy frequency. At 0912, she heard Captain Oak's voice. "Clear view, convoy is rolling. All elements confirm." One by one, the vehicle commanders confirmed. She listened to their voices and thought about their faces from the brief Corporal Riches with his premonition, the 2 squad leaders who had asked about dead zones, the vehicle commanders she had only seen in passing. 480 people moving through the wire and into the basin and toward the point of a trap they couldn't see. She pressed her cheek against the stock of the rifle, and then she saw them. Not the convoy. The convoy was still several minutes out, still winding along the lower approach road before it entered the basin proper. What she saw was a movement on the far side of the northern shell, 270 meters from her position, just above the limestone outcropping. She had ranged at 410 meters from the road. It was exactly where she had told Captain Oakes to look. A rifle barrel, then a head, then a second head, then a third position 20 meters to the south where 3 men were repositioning behind a natural rock parapet she had marked in her notebook as firing position 7. They were wearing earth-tone clothing, and they were not moving quickly. They were moving with the practiced, unhurried patience of men who had been in position for hours and were simply making final adjustments before the main event. She counted 9 visible positions across the ridgeline in the space of 4 minutes. She knew there were more she couldn't see. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She found the crosshairs on the furthest position 460 meters. Slight crosswind from the west elevation drop of 40 meters from her position to theirs. And she did the math in her head the way Delgado had taught her, the way she had practiced 1,000 times on ranges and in her imagination until the calculation happened without conscious thought. She did not fire. Not yet. Not until the convoy was committed. Not until there was no other way. Her radio crackled. Oakes's voice, "All elements, we are entering the basin. Maintain intervals. Eyes on the ridgelines." She almost laughed. Eyes on the ridgelines. As if any of them knew what they were looking for. as if any of them were looking at the right shelves. The first vehicle rounded the lower bend and came into her sightline, moving at a steady 20 kilometers per hour. Then the second, then the third. 480 people threading themselves into a corridor that was about to close around them like a fist. The man on position 7 raised his head and looked down at the approaching convoy. Elena Cruz put her finger on the trigger. And then she heard it, something that stopped her heart for 1 full second and then restarted it at twice the speed. Corporal Reyes's voice on the radio, young and clear and completely calm. "Sergeant Cruz, are you monitoring this frequency? I need you to confirm." The convoy frequency exploded with Captain Oakes's voice cutting through like a blade. "All elements maintain radio discipline. Cruz, shut your comms down. We do not need chatter during." And then the ridge above the northern shelf lit up with the muzzle flash of 11 separate firing positions, opening up simultaneously, and the world below her became fire and smoke, and the sound of 480 people learning all at once that Elena Cruz had been right. The first volley tore through the lead vehicle's front axle, and the sound was not like anything they show in movies. It was not a single clean crack. It was a wall of noise, overlapping and continuous bouncing off both ridgelines simultaneously, so that it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the ground itself, from the sky, from inside the chests of every Marine in that convoy who had just understood in a single crystalline second that they had driven straight into the jaws of something that had been waiting for them. Elena did not wait. She did not hesitate. She did not pray or second guess or recalculate. The moment the first muzzle flashes erupted from position 7, her muscle memory took over with a completeness that surprised even her, and she found her first target in the scope, exhaled half a breath, and squeezed. The rifle kicked back against her shoulder, and the man at position 7 dropped. She cycled the bolt without lifting her cheek from the stock, swung 4 degrees left, found the second shooter at the adjacent position while he was still tracking his rifle barrel down toward the stalled convoy, and squeezed again. 2 shots, 2 targets. Elapsed time 4 seconds. On the valley floor below, chaos had already taken hold. She could hear it on the radio even as she was working the bolt for a third shot. Voices colliding over each other, some shouting contact reports, some calling for medical, some simply shouting the organized frequency discipline of the convoy brief completely dissolved in the first 30 seconds of contact. Contact right, taking fire from the eastern ridge. Vehicle 3 is hit. We have casualties. All elements dismount, seek cover, dismount. Where is it coming from? I can't see where it's coming from. She found position 3, a 2-man team at roughly 380 meters, partially concealed behind a limestone parapet. The first man had his weapon up and was firing in controlled bursts at the convoy below. The second was spotting for him using a scope, calling adjustments. She took the spotter first because a fighter without a spotter is half blind, and then she took the shooter while he was still looking for what had just happened to the man next to him. The radio was still screaming. Captain Oakes's voice cut through twice, trying to establish command and control, and she could hear in his voice something she had never heard there before. Not panic. Oakes was too disciplined for panic, but uncertainty, the specific terrible uncertainty of a man who has just discovered that his model of the world was wrong in a way that cannot be undone. All elements, we are in a prepared ambush. Vehicles 1 through 4 push through to the curve. Vehicles 5 through 9 reverse to the last covered position. Dismounts. I need suppressive fire on the eastern ridge, full line. She was already working position 6 when she heard Corporal Reyes's voice cut through. Young, clear, still completely calm in a way that did not match how young he was. "Sergeant Cruz, are you up on this net? I need someone to tell me where to look." She almost keyed her radio. She stopped herself. If she transmitted, Oakes would hear her voice. He would know where she was. He would know what she had done. That conversation had a time and a place, and it was not now while there were still 9 firing positions active on this ridgeline. She found position 9. The man at position 9 was good. He had moved the moment the first of his teammates went down, relocated 3 meters to a secondary firing position behind a different rock formation, and was already back on target, tracking the Marines scrambling along the valley floor below. He was patient, the way trained fighters are patient. He didn't spray. He picked targets and worked methodically. She ranged him at 490 meters. Crosswind had shifted 2 degrees to the south in the last 4 minutes, which meant a half-mil right correction. She made the adjustment. She found him in the scope. He was good. She was better. She worked through positions 9, 11, and 12 in just under 3 minutes. Position 12 was occupied by 3 men instead of the 2 she had estimated, and the third man saw her muzzle flash from across the basin and started screaming something in a language she didn't understand, pointing in her direction. For approximately 12 seconds, she was a known target on the ridgeline. She went flat. She pressed herself into the limestone depression. With every ounce of weight, she had pulled the ghillie suit tight across her back and did not breathe. 3 rounds struck the rock, face 6 meters to her left. Then 2 more closer, then nothing. She counted to 20 and came back up. Position 12's third man was repositioning, trying to get a better angle on where she had been. He had moved to the wrong place. She corrected for the new distance and put him down. 11 positions gone. She had been on the ridge for less than 8 minutes. The radio was still burning. She could hear the battle evolving below her, the sound of Marines who had recovered from the initial shock and were starting to fight back the flat crack of M4s and the deeper bark of the 240 laying suppressive fire on the ridge, the rhythm of a unit that had trained for this even when they hadn't known they were training for it. But the suppressive fire was going to the wrong places. She could hear Oakes directing it, hear him reading the ridgeline from the valley floor, and he was getting it wrong by 30 to 40 meters. In most cases, sending rounds into empty rock while the remaining fighters adjusted and held. Eastern Ridge Section, 2 full suppression vehicle commanders maintain fire until I call cease. She keyed her radio for the first time. She didn't identify herself. She just said, "The remaining positions are offset north of where you're shooting. They've moved. Shift fire left approximately 40 meters. Reference the double limestone overhang at your 12 o'clock. Dead silence on the frequency for 2 full seconds. And then Oakes's voice stripped of everything except pure raw confusion. "Who is this? Identify yourself. All elements who just transmitted." She released the key. She found position 14 in the scope, the last confirmed firing position she had cataloged before the ambush opened, located on the far northern end of the shelf, at roughly 510 meters, occupied by a 2-man team with what looked like an RPG launcher. The RPG was the thing she was most afraid of. 1 round from that launcher into a stalled vehicle full of Marines was the kind of loss you didn't recover from tactically or emotionally. She ranged the position carefully. 512 meters. Elevation difference plus 31 meters. Wind steady at 9 kilometers per hour from the northwest. She needed to put the first shot on the launcher before the man carrying it understood what was happening. She breathed. She found the stillness inside herself that Delgado had called the pocket, the place between Marl's heartbeats where time slows and the crosshairs stop moving and the calculation becomes simple. She found the pocket. She fired. The round caught the launcher's tube at approximately mid-length, and the RPG team scattered, 1 man running left, 1 dropping flat. She took the 1 running left before he reached cover. The 1 who dropped flat stayed flat, and she left him there. A man pressed flat against a rock isn't firing at a convoy. A man running is a man making a decision, and decisions had consequences. "Unidentified station, I am ordering you to identify yourself. This is Captain Oakes. Acknowledge." She was already scanning for residual positions, looking for muzzle flash, looking for movement, looking for the specific quality of stillness that meant a man was hiding rather than absent. Below her, she could hear the character of the radio traffic beginning to change. The calls for medical were still coming. They would keep coming, but the volume of incoming fire was dropping. She could feel it even from the ridge, the way you can feel a storm passing, the way the air changes before it clears. "Vehicles 1 and 2 are through the bend," someone reported. "We have a lane." "Push 3 and 4 through," Oakes ordered. "Dismounts cover their movement. Weapon squad maintains suppression on the ridge." She found 1 more position, a lone fighter she had not cataloged, who had apparently held his fire during the initial burst and was only now engaging, targeting the dismounted Marines using the stalled vehicles as cover. He was located in a gap between her position 8 and position 9, in a natural shadow he had assessed as empty during her initial survey. She had been wrong. It bothered her the way mistakes always bothered her, not with panic, but with the cold clinical certainty that she needed to be better. She corrected the mistake, and then the ridge went quiet. Not completely, there was still sporadic incoming from somewhere on the western ridge that the Marines below were working to identify and suppress, but the eastern shelf, the killing ground, The geography she had warned them about in a briefing room, while men laughed at the map in her hand, was silent. 14 confirmed firing positions. 14 positions dismantled in just over 11 minutes. She lowered her rifle, and for the first time since the ambush opened, she became aware of her own body, the trembling in her forearms, the sweat soaking through the ghillie suit, the copper taste of adrenaline at the back of her throat. Her hands were not shaking. She noted that with a detached kind of satisfaction. They had not shaken once. The radio in her ear was a different world now. The frenzy had compressed into something harder and more functional. Casualty reports, vehicle status, ammunition counts, the language of a unit that had been hit and was assessing how badly and what it could still do. Casualty count, Oakes said. His voice was flat and controlled in the way that voices get flat and controlled when the person using them is working very hard not to let anyone else know what they're feeling. Sir, we have 11 wounded, 3 critical. 2 KIA confirmed. A pause. Vehicle 3 is immobile. We're going to need a tow. 2 killed, 11 wounded. She closed her eyes for a moment and then opened them because closing her eyes didn't change anything and there was still work to do. She keyed the radio again. Your Western Ridge contact is a 2-man position at approximately 400 meters offset 15 degrees south of your Vehicle 1. They're using a depression in the rock that your sight lines from the valley floor can't reach. You need to flank north and approach from the upper drainage to suppress. Silence again. Then who is this? Oakes's voice had changed. The confusion was still there, but something else had moved in alongside it. Something that wasn't gratitude, and wasn't anger, and wasn't anything she could name precisely, but felt from this distance like the first moment a very stubborn person begins to understand they were wrong about something fundamental. Someone who looked at your maps a little more carefully than you did, sir. She released the key. For 6 seconds, nothing happened. Then she heard Holloway's voice, quiet, careful, professional, telling a fire team to push north along the drainage route toward the Western Ridge contact. She looked out over the basin. Below her, the convoy was threading itself through the bottleneck at reference point Delta, 1 vehicle at a time, moving with the controlled urgency of people who have survived something they weren't supposed to survive and know it. She watched them move, and she felt something complicated and enormous in her chest. That wasn't quite pride, and wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite grief, though it was all of those things braided together into something she didn't have a word for. Corporal Reyes's voice came through the radio clearer now, closer to whatever position he had taken during the contact. That voice on the frequency, he said. That was Sergeant Cruz, wasn't it? Nobody answered him. It was Cruz, he said again, and this time it wasn't a question. On the Western Ridge, she heard the 240 open up, and then 2 M4s, and then silence. Holloway's voice came back. Western Ridge contact is suppressed. Confirmed 2 enemy down, position clear. All elements, Oakes said, push through. Let's get our people out. She watched the last vehicles move through the bend at Delta and disappear around the rock formation. She watched the dismounted Marines follow in organized bounds, covering each other's movement. She watched 447 people, 480 minus the 2 who weren't coming home, and the 31 who were being loaded into vehicle beds with field dressings on their wounds, move through the kill zone that was no longer a kill zone because she had made it that way. She began field stripping the area around her position. Brass casings into a bag, notebook into her inside pocket, spotting scope broken down and packed. She worked quickly and methodically, erasing the evidence of her presence the way she had been taught, the way a sniper leaves a position, as if she had never been there at all. Her radio crackled one more time. Captain Oakes. She almost didn't recognize his voice because it had shed every bit of the tone she had come to associate with him, the indifference, the amusement, the flat condescension of a man who believed he understood everything he needed to understand. What was left underneath all of that was simply a human voice, and it was asking a human question. Unidentified station, are you still up on this frequency? She paused with her hand on the radio. We have 2 Marines who aren't going home tonight because I didn't listen when I should have. A long pause. I don't know who you are or where you are or what you used to do, what you just did, but I need you to know that I know, whatever that's worth to you. She stared at the radio for a long moment. Then she keyed it one last time. Get your people home, Captain. She released the key and turned the radio off. She shouldered her pack, checked the ridge line once in each direction, and began moving north along the spine of the eastern shelf away from the firing positions and away from the limestone depression that had been her home for the last 2 hours back toward the drainage channel in the basin, whatever was waiting for her there. She moved carefully as she always moved with the patience of someone who understood that surviving the action was only half the problem. Surviving what came after was the other half. She had not gone 300 meters when she heard footsteps on the loose shale behind her. She stopped. She did not reach for her rifle because the footsteps were too irregular to be tactical movement, too direct, too loud. The footsteps of someone who wasn't trying to be quiet because they weren't trained to be or because they didn't care if she heard them coming. She turned around. Corporal Reyes was standing 12 meters behind her on the ridge trail, breathing hard from the climb. His rifle slung, his face red with exertion and something that wasn't anger. He had his hands at his sides and he was looking at her the way young men sometimes look at things they don't have the vocabulary for yet. How, he said. She looked at him. How did you know, he said, before at the brief? How did you know it was going to happen? She didn't answer right away. She was thinking about whether to answer at all, about what purpose the answer served, about whether this young man from Phoenix, who had asked the right question in the wrong room, deserved the truth. She decided he did. Because I looked at the maps, she said. Because someone taught me what danger looks like when it's wearing the shape of geography. And because nobody else was looking. Reyes stared at her. Two of our guys, I know. If we'd left earlier, if you'd been... He stopped himself, swallowed. You were right. You told him and he didn't. I know, Corporal. That's not right, he said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word and he pressed his jaw tight to control it. That is not right. No, she said. It isn't. They stood on the ridge in the quiet that follows catastrophe, the specific quiet of a place where terrible things have just stopped happening. Somewhere below them, the convoy was moving. Somewhere below them, two families were going to receive news that would unmake them. And somewhere below them, Captain Oakes was driving through a valley he had not understood and would spend the rest of his life understanding differently. What happens now, Reyes asked, to you? She picked up her pack and turned back toward the drainage channel. I go back, she said. And then she kept walking. And then we find out what kind of place this is, she said. What it does with people who were right about things it didn't want to hear. She didn't look back, but she heard him stand there for a long moment before his footsteps turned and went back down the ridge the way they had come. She heard him stop once halfway down, and she knew without seeing it that he was looking up at the limestone shelf where she had spent the morning trying to see what it would have looked like from the valley floor, trying to understand the geometry of what had happened here. She rounded the last switchback on the drainage channel, and the base came into view below her, small and flat and ordinary in the afternoon heat. She could see the motor pool. She could see the comms tent. She could see parked near the battalion headquarters of building 3 vehicles that had not been there this morning and bore the markings of the regimental command element. She stopped. She looked at the vehicles for a long time. Then she adjusted her pack, checked that her ghillie suit was rolled tight and fully concealed inside her ruck, and walked through the wire like a woman who had nothing to explain and everything to answer for, and understood clearly that both of those things were true at the same time. Lieutenant Ferris was waiting for her at the edge of the motor pool. He was not alone. Beside him stood a master sergeant she didn't recognize and a military police corporal with a notepad. Ferris had his cover in his hand, turning it slowly by the brim, the way men turn things when they are trying to decide how to begin. She stopped in front of him and stood straight. He looked at her for a very long time. She watched his face move through several expressions before it settled on the one he could live with. It was not anger. It was not relief. It was not the cautious, managed indifference he'd worn when he told her the captain was a good officer. It was something rawer than any of that. 447 Marines crossed that basin today, he said quietly. Yes, sir. 2 didn't. Yes, sir. He looked at the ground, then back at her. We're going to need your rifle, Sergeant. We're going to need your ammunition log. And we're going to need you to sit down with the regimental judge advocate first thing tomorrow morning. Yes, sir. He started to turn away, stopped. Cruz. Sir. He looked at her one more time with those eyes that had something moving behind them he wasn't going to put words to. You need anything before you go in. She thought about it. No, she said. I'm good. He nodded once and walked toward the headquarters building, and the master sergeant, and the MP corporal fell in behind her. And Elena Cruz walked across the motor pool with the dust of the Eastern Ridge still on her boots, and the weight of what she had done and what it would cost pressing down on her from every direction, and she did not lower her head, not once, not for a single step. She had been right. She had paid for it. She would keep paying for it. And somewhere on the far side of this valley, 447 Marines were still breathing. She could live with that math. The regimental judge advocate's name was Major Sylvia Tran, and she had a reputation across 3 battalions for being the kind of lawyer who did not waste words or sympathy on people who had made decisions they were fully prepared to defend. She was 41 years old, had spent 6 years as a JAG officer, after 2 years as an infantry officer before a knee injury redirected her career, and she sat across the table from Elena the following morning with a legal pad, a pen, and an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. Elena had slept 3 hours. She had eaten half a ration bar. She had cleaned her rifle and logged every round, fired 31 in total, in a personal notebook. She had surrendered to the master sergeant the night before, along with the Remington and the spotting scope and the ghillie suit. She had done all of this without being asked, because the fastest way through a proceeding like this was to give them everything they were going to find anyway and not make them work for it. Major Tran looked at the ammunition log for a long time, then at Elena, then back at the log. 31 rounds, she said. Yes, ma'am. And you're telling me that across 14 firing positions in 11 minutes of active engagement, you expended 31 rounds? Yes, ma'am. Tran put the log down. Do you understand what the charge sheet looks like right now, Sergeant Cruz? Unauthorized use of government equipment, departure from assigned post without authorization, conduct unbecoming, possible dereliction of duty for abandoning comms responsibilities during an active operation. Elena paused. And operating as a sniper without a current sniper MOS qualification, which is the one that will probably give the prosecution the most traction because it's the cleanest to argue. Tran looked at her steadily. You've thought about this. I've thought about it for a long time, ma'am, not just last night. And you proceeded anyway. Yes, ma'am. Why, Bessie? Elena looked at her hands on the table, then back up. Because I was right, and I knew about I was right, and I also knew that nobody with the authority to act on it was going to listen. And because the alternative to proceeding was watching 480 people walk into a kill zone that I could have stopped. Tran was quiet for a moment. Outside the thin walls of the conference room, the base was resuming its normal rhythms. Vehicles moving, equipment being loaded, the ordinary sounds of an installation that had absorbed a shock and was recalibrating. Elena could hear all of it, and none of it registered as meaningful. The only meaningful thing in the world right now was this room and this woman and this legal pad. The casualty count from yesterday's operation, Tran said, 2K IA-11 wounded. Battalion surgeon assessed that without disruption of the Eastern Ridge line firing positions, the convoy would have sustained a minimum of 60% casualties inside the first 6 minutes of contact based on vehicle positioning and the geometry of the ambush setup. She paused deliberately. 60% of 480 is 288. Elena didn't respond. The S2 ran a retroactive analysis last night at Lieutenant Colonel Barnes's direction. They've confirmed 14 firing positions on the Eastern Shelf consistent with your ammunition log. They've also confirmed that the Western Ridge contact, the one you called in on the frequency, was a secondary element intended to prevent withdrawal from the kill zone once the Eastern assault opened. Elena absorbed this. She had suspected a secondary element, but hadn't been able to confirm it from her position on the Eastern Ridge. Hearing it confirmed now with the cold professional precision of a retroactive analysis made the back of her neck go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the room temperature. If your transmission about the Western Ridge had not directed Sergeant Holloway's team to the correct approach route, Tran continued, the secondary element would have achieved fire superiority over the withdrawal route within approximately 4 minutes. At that point, the convoy would have had no viable egress. They sat with that for a moment. Then Tran picked up her pen. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them completely and accurately. This interview is being recorded. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. The interview lasted 4 hours. Tran covered everything: how Elena had obtained the Remington, the nature of her prior exposure to scout sniper training, her analysis of the basin maps, every transmission she had made on the convoy frequency, every shot she had taken, and the rationale behind its sequence and priority. She asked about Holloway, and Elena answered as carefully as she could without implicating him in anything he hadn't actually done. She asked about Corporal Reyes, and Elena told her about the ridge and the conversation and the young man's cracked voice and his question about what was right. Tron wrote everything down without changing her expression once. At the end of the fourth hour, she set her pen down and looked at Elena directly, and for the first time since the session began, something shifted in the professional mask, not enough to call it emotion, but enough to call it acknowledgement. The recognition of one person by another, unmediated by rank or charge sheet or legal pad. "You know what's interesting about this case," Tran said. Elena waited. "The easiest thing for everyone involved would be to process the charges, accept a plea, reduce your rank, and reassign you to a base somewhere far from anyone who was in Carsa Basin yesterday. Clean, documented, legally airtight." She paused. "But Lieutenant Colonel Barnes asked me this morning to delay filing until he's had a conversation with regimental command. Which means someone above your pay grade and mine is already trying to decide what this looks like and what it means." "What does that mean for the charges, ma'am?" "It means nothing yet. It means everything is still in motion." Tron gathered her papers and stood. "Stay on base. Don't speak to the media if they somehow get wind of this, which they won't. Don't speak to Captain Oakes without me present." She stopped at the door. "And Sergeant Cruz?" Elena looked up. "Eat something. You look like you've been awake for 2 days." She was almost right. It had been 31 hours. Holloway found her outside the mess hall an hour later. He sat down across from her with a tray he wasn't going to eat and the expression of a man who had spent the better part of the last 24 hours deciding exactly what he wanted to say and had now decided to say all of it. "Barnes knows," he said. "I know he knows. He knows about the maps. He knows about the drainage channel. He knows you identified the Western Ridge contact." He lowered his voice. "He also knows that Oakes had the same briefing you gave him and dismissed it, and he knows that the S2 assessment that cleared the road was based on a 72-hour drone window that had a 14-hour gap in coverage because of a maintenance issue that nobody flagged to the convoy commander." Elena went very still. "What gap?" "The drones went down for maintenance from 03 to 1700 on the day before the convoy. The insurgents moved their main force into position during that window. The S2 knew about the gap. He cleared the route anyway because the pre-gap imagery was clean and he didn't want to delay the operational timeline." Holloway looked at her. "The fighters in those positions, they were already in place when our drones came back online. They were already holding still. Exactly like you said they would be." She thought about Captain Oakes standing at the briefing table with his laser pointer and his confidence, and she thought about what it would feel like to be him right now standing on the far side of that knowledge. She didn't enjoy the thought. She was surprised to discover she almost felt sorry for him, and then she was surprised by the surprise because she was not a person who expected to feel sorry for the man who had laughed at her in front of a room. "Who else knows about the gap?" she asked. "Right now, Barnes, the S2 officer, Tran, and me." He paused. "And you. The S2 officer is going to have a very bad week. The S2 officer is already having a very bad week." Holloway picked up a fork and put it back down without using it. "Elena, I need to ask you something." "Ask." "If the charges go forward, if they court-martial you, what are you going to do?" She thought about it. Not about the legal strategy, which was Tran's domain, and she trusted Tran to work it correctly. She thought about the deeper question underneath the surface, the question Holloway was really asking, which was whether she was going to be okay. "What I'm going to do," she said, "is stand in a courtroom and answer every question they ask me, and I'm going to tell them exactly what I told Tran. I knew. I warned them. They didn't listen. I made a decision. I would make it again." Holloway nodded slowly. "Even knowing what it costs. Especially knowing what it costs." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite sadness, and was actually more like the way people look at something they understand completely and can't change and have decided to simply witness. "Okay," he said. That afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes called her into his office. Barnes was 63 years old. He had the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of decisions and their consequences not hardened exactly but tempered. He stood when she came in, which surprised her because a lieutenant colonel standing for a sergeant was not something that happened in any version of normal military protocol she was familiar with. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and sat back down when she sat. He said nothing for the long moment. He looked at the wall to her right where a framed photograph of a Marine unit in desert camouflage was hanging. Then he looked back at her. "I've been in this Corps for 38 years, he said. "I've made decisions in contact that I was certain about and turned out to be right. I've made decisions in contact that I was certain about and turned out to be catastrophically wrong." He paused. "Do you know which of those stays with you longer?" She didn't answer because it wasn't really a question. "The regimental commander is going to call me in approximately 2 hours, he said. "He's going to ask me what happened in Carsa Basin, and I'm going to tell him. I'm going to tell him all of it. The S2 coverage gap, the dismissed brief, the charge sheet Tran is holding." He looked at her steadily. "And I'm going to tell him what my recommendation is." Elena kept her face neutral. Her heart was not neutral. "What is your recommendation, sir?" He was quiet for 3 full seconds. It was the longest 3 seconds she had experienced since the moment on the eastern ridge when incoming rounds were striking the rock face 6 meters from her head. "My recommendation," he said, "depends on something I need to understand about you, Sergeant Cruz. Not tactically, not legally." He leaned forward slightly. 7 years in this Corps, twice passed over for promotion, removed from the scout sniper training roster without explanation, repeatedly dismissed in briefings by officers with less situational awareness than you demonstrably possess. He folded his hands on the desk. "And you're still here. Why?" She looked at him. She had not expected the question and she had not prepared for it, which meant the answer she gave him was the only honest kind, the kind that comes out before the editor gets to it. "Because I'm good at this," she said. "And because being good at something that matters, something that keeps people alive, is not a thing I'm willing to give up just because other people can't see it yet." Barnes looked at her for a long time after that. Then his phone rang. He held up one finger and she waited. He answered, listened for 30 seconds, said 3 words she couldn't hear, and hung up. "That was not the regimental commander," Vinny said. "That was the battalion surgeon." He paused. "Corporal Ray is the young man from Phoenix. He's been in with the battalion surgeon for the last 2 hours. Not for wounds. He presented voluntarily this morning, requesting to make a formal statement about what he observed on the Eastern Ridge yesterday. The surgeon confirmed the statement and has already forwarded it to Tran's office." Elena went very still. "What kind of statement?" "An eyewitness account of observing Sergeant Elena Cruz in a prepared overwatch position on the Eastern Ridge, conducting precision fire in support of the Clearview convoy during an active ambush event, with a level of skill and effectiveness he described as," Barnes glanced at a note on his desk, "the most precise and controlled shooting I have ever witnessed by any shooter in any context." Something moved through her that she did not have a name for. It was not relief exactly. It was more like the sensation of a door opening in a wall you had stopped believing had a door. "He climbed that ridge," Barnes said, "to make sure someone put it on record before it got buried." He looked at her. 22 years old. She thought about Corporal Reyes standing 12 meters behind her on the trail, with his hands at his sides, saying that is not right in a voice that cracked on the last word. She thought about how wrong it was to be that young and that clear about something that complicated. "Sir," she said carefully, "I need you to make sure he doesn't face any professional consequences for making that statement." "He won't." "Captain Oakes." "Captain Oakes," Barnes said, with a precision that made the sentence feel like a file closing, "is currently completing an after-action report under the direct supervision of the regimental executive officer. He will not be interfering with any witness in this matter." The room was quiet. Through the wall, she could hear the base moving vehicles, voices, the mechanical rhythm of a military installation continuing to exist despite the things that happened inside it and around it and because of it. "What happens now, sir?" she asked. He stood, which meant she stood. He looked at her across the desk with the measured, complicated expression of a man who had been doing a difficult job for 38 years and had just encountered something that made the trauma feel for the first time in a while like it was worth the difficulty. "Now," he said, "I make a phone call to the regimental commander, and I tell him that I have a sergeant on this base who identified a prepared ambush position using terrain analysis, voluntarily entered a combat environment without authorization, conducted precision fire operations, that dismantled 14 enemy firing positions and prevented what our own S2 assessment calls a near-certain massacre, and who has 7 years of service, no sniper, MOS, and a court-martial charge sheet sitting in a JAG office 1 building away. He paused. And then I tell him what I think we should do about all of that. She stood at attention. And what do you think we should do about it, sir? Barnes almost smiled. It was a brief thing, barely there, the kind of expression that a man with his face uses instead of the larger version. I think he said that we should stop wasting you. She walked out of his office into the flat afternoon heat of the base, and for the first time since she had come through the wire the previous evening with dust on her boots and the weight of everything pressing down, she felt the weight shift, not lift, not disappear. It was still there, every ounce of it, the 2 Marines who hadn't come home, the charge sheet, the rifle she had surrendered, the court-martial that still might happen, regardless of Barnes's recommendation, because these things had their own momentum and their own logic, and a 2-star general somewhere in a clean office in a city far from Carsa Basin would ultimately decide which direction this went. But the weight had shifted, and that was different from what it had been this morning. Holloway was waiting outside the headquarters building. He read her face before she could say a word. "Well," he said, "he's making a call. To regiment?" "Yes." Holloway let out a slow breath. "That could go either way." "I know. Barnes is a good man, but regiment is regiment." "I know that too." He looked at her carefully. "How are you holding up actual answer?" She thought about it. "I'm okay. I'm tired. I keep thinking about the 2 we lost." "That's going to take a while," he said quietly. "That doesn't go away fast." "No," she said. "I know it doesn't." They stood together in the heat and said nothing for a moment, the way people do when the silence is more honest than anything either of them could manufacture out of words. Somewhere across the motor pool, a vehicle engine turned over and then stalled, and someone swore loudly about it, and the ordinary stupid normalcy of the sound was somehow the most stabilizing thing Elena had heard in 36 hours. "Reyes made a statement," she told him. Holloway blinked. "The corporal. He climbed that ridge. He saw enough. He went to the surgeon this morning and put it on record." Holloway stared at her. Then he looked away toward the motor pool jaw working. When he looked back, his eyes were brighter than they'd been, and he was pressing his mouth into a line that was doing a lot of work to stay flat. 22 years old, he said. That's what Barnes said. "Good kid." "Yeah," she said. "He is." The call from the regimental commander came 4 hours later. Barnes took it alone. He emerged from his office 17 minutes afterward and walked directly to Tran's office. 20 minutes after that, Tran walked directly to the billet where Elena was waiting and sat down across from her on a folding chair and put her legal pad on her knee. "The charge sheet," Tran said, "is being held in abeyance pending a formal review board." Elena didn't move. "What does that mean practically?" "It means nothing is dismissed and nothing is proceeding. It means the regimental commander wants the full picture before anyone commits to a direction." Tran paused. "It also means that someone in regiment has apparently already spoken to someone at MARSOC regarding your profile, your training history, and the 31 rounds in your ammunition log." The words sat in the air between them like something with weight. MARSOC, Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command. Elena looked at Tran, and for the first time in 36 hours, something happened in her chest that she identified cautiously and with every reservation she possessed as something that might eventually become hope. "Who initiated that contact?" she said. Tran looked at her legal pad, then at Elena. "Barnes," she said simply. 30 minutes after he got off the phone with the regimental commander. He made a second call. Elena sat back. Outside, across the base, the sun was going down over the western ridge, painting the same limestone faces that had sheltered men who had meant to kill 480 people the previous morning. The rock didn't know what had happened on it. The rock didn't care. The rock would be there long after everyone in this story was gone, which was either a terrible thought or a comforting one, depending on how you held it. She decided to hold it as a comforting one. She had made harder decisions with less reason. "What do I do now?" she asked. Tran stood and straightened her uniform. "Now you wait," she said, "and you do not under any circumstances touch a rifle that isn't specifically assigned to you through official channels." "Understood." "And cruise." Tran paused at the door. For what it's worth, and I say this strictly off the record, and as someone who has been a woman in this institution for 15 years. She looked at her directly. What you did on that ridge was not nothing. Whatever they decide to do about it, it was not nothing. She left. Elena sat alone in the quiet of the billet and thought about 14 firing positions and 31 rounds and a 22-year-old from Phoenix who had climbed a ridge to make sure nobody buried the truth. She thought about Barnes making a second phone call. She thought about the word MARSOC hanging in the air of a room with a folding chair and a legal pad. She did not let herself feel too much of it yet. She had learned long ago that hope required the same discipline as everything else. You had to control it, pace it, give it only as much space as the facts currently justified. The facts currently justified a small amount. She gave it that much and no more. But she kept the word. She kept it in the same place inside herself where she had kept Delgado's lessons and the maps and the certainty that she had been right about Carsa Basin when no one else would look. She kept it in the place where things waited until they were needed. Somewhere outside, Corporal Reyes was eating dinner in the mess hall with his squad, and Lieutenant Colonel Barnes was writing a report that would travel up a chain of command whose end she could not yet see. And Captain Oakes was somewhere in this same base, in this same heat, living inside the knowledge of what his dismissal had cost and what someone else's refusal to be dismissed had saved. Elena Cruz lay back on her cot and stared at the canvas above her. She breathed in, she breathed out. She did not let her hands shake. They had not shaken once. The review board convened 9 days after Carsa Basin. It was not the court-martial Elena had prepared for. It was something more ambiguous and therefore more dangerous, a formal investigative proceeding with no guaranteed outcome, in either direction, presided over by a 3-member panel that included a colonel from the regimental staff, a lieutenant colonel from the inspector general's office, and a civilian legal advisor whose presence alone signaled that someone above the regimental level had decided this situation required careful handling. Major Tran sat to Elena's left. The charge sheet, still technically active, sat in a folder on the table between them, like an unexploded device neither side wanted to be the first to touch. Elena had spent the 9 days in a state of disciplined suspension. She had reported for duty every morning, performed her communications responsibilities with the same precision. She always had eaten 3 meals a day, slept approximately 5 hours a night, and not spoken publicly about anything that had happened in Carsa Basin. She had followed every instruction Tran gave her to the letter. She had not touched a rifle. She had not contacted Reyes, though she had seen him twice across the motor pool, and both times he had given her a small, serious nod that communicated everything his rank prevented him from saying out loud. She had spoken to her mother once briefly from the comms tent on a personal line after hours. Her mother was 64 years old and had raised 3 children in San Antonio on a school teacher's salary after Elena's father came home from Desert Storm in a condition that required more care than he was ever willing to admit he needed. Her mother had listened to Elena's careful, sanitized version of the last 9 days and then said in Spanish the same thing she had said every time Elena had called from a difficult place for the past 7 years. You are still standing. Not a question, a confirmation. The way you confirm something you already know but need to hear from outside yourself. Yes, Elena had said, I'm still standing. The review board began at 0800 with the colonel reading the formal scope of the proceeding into the record. He was a trim man named Colonel Hargrove, with close-cropped gray hair, in the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this and understood that the words used in them had weight that outlasted the moment. He read the scope without looking up from the paper, and Elena listened to every word and noted the ones that mattered. Unauthorized departure from assigned post. Unauthorized use of government-issued equipment. Conduct inconsistent with assigned military occupational specialty. Engagement of enemy forces without authorization or qualification. Then the other words, the ones that had been added, resulting in the disruption of 14 confirmed enemy firing positions, resulting in the preservation of convoy elements, and reduction of what battalion medical and intelligence assessment determined to be a near certain mass casualty event, conducted with a level of tactical proficiency and individual marksmanship consistent with special operations qualification standards. The civilian legal advisor, a woman named Price who had short gray hair and wore glasses and had not introduced herself beyond her last name, was writing steadily in a notebook. She had not looked up once. Hargrove set the paper down. Sergeant Cruz, you have been advised of your rights, and you've chosen to proceed without invoking your right to silence. Is that correct? Yes, sir. You understand that any statement you make in this proceeding can be used in a subsequent court-martial proceeding if this board determines that course of action is appropriate. Yes, sir. Then let's begin. The first hour covered terrain. They walked her through the maps, the analysis, the briefing she had given Oakes, and the briefing Oakes had dismissed. The Inspector General's Lieutenant Colonel, a compact woman named Vasquez, who asked questions in short, direct sentences that had no preamble and no softening, spent 20 minutes specifically on the moment Elena had left the ops room after being dismissed and what she had done in the hours immediately following. You returned to your billet, Vasquez said. Yes, ma'am, and began assembling equipment. I began thinking, Elena said. The assembling came later. Walk me through the thinking. She did. She walked them through it the same way she had walked Tran through it, with the same precision and the same honesty, because there was no version of this story that was better for her than the true one. The true one had the virtue of being coherent and the additional virtue of being demonstrably correct in its conclusions, which was a combination that not every person sitting across a review board table could claim. When she finished, Vasquez looked at her for a long moment. You assessed that the convoy would sustain catastrophic casualties. Yes, ma'am. And you assessed that no one with authority to alter the convoy plan was going to act on your warning. Yes, ma'am. So you decided to act unilaterally. I decided that someone had to. The room was very quiet after that. Hargrove shifted in his chair. Sergeant Cruz, helped me understand something. You are 7 years into a Marine Corps career. You understand the chain of command. You understand the consequences of operating outside it. He paused. And yet, she agreed. Walk me through that decision one more time. Not the tactical analysis, the personal decision. She thought about how to say it. Not about whether to say it, she had already made that choice, but how to say it in a way that was honest without being reckless, direct without being insubordinate to a panel that held her professional future in its hands. I thought about the two worst outcomes, she said. If I went up that ridge and I was wrong, the convoy made it through safely and I faced a court-martial. If I didn't go up that ridge and I was right, 480 people walked into a prepared kill zone with no overwatch, no warning, and no way out. She looked at Hargrove steadily. I ran the math, sir. The math only came out one way. The civilian advisor, Price, looked up from her notebook for the first time. She said nothing. She just looked at Elena for approximately 4 seconds and then looked back down. It was such a specific and deliberate action that it felt like a statement. The second hour moved to the operational record. The panel called in the battalion S2 officer, a captain named Desmond, who was 29 years old and had the complexion of a man who had not slept properly in 9 days. He confirmed the drone coverage gap. He confirmed that the route clearance assessment had been filed with the known gap unaddressed. He confirmed in a voice that had gone flat and professional, in the way voices do when the person using them is trying to survive a very bad experience with their composure intact, that he had made a decision he now recognized was not adequately supported by the available intelligence picture. Vasquez asked him one question. Did you brief Captain Oakes on the coverage gap before the convoy departed? Desmond said, No, ma'am. The room processed this. Elena watched the panel members' faces and saw in each of them a version of the same expression. Not anger, not satisfaction, but the particular gravity of people who are assembling a picture and finding that each new piece makes the picture more difficult to look at. Then Captain Oakes came in. He walked in with his back straight and his cover under his arm, and his face arranged in the expression of professional composure that Elena had come to understand over the past 9 days of watching him across the base was costing him significant effort to maintain. He was not the same man who had laughed in the briefing room and told her she was a radio girl. Something had happened to that man somewhere in Carsabusan, and he had not found all the pieces yet. He sat down. He looked at the panel. He did not look at Elena. Hargrove said, Captain Oakes, when Sergeant Cruz presented her terrain analysis to you prior to the Clearview convoy brief, what was your assessment of her concerns? Oakes said, I assessed them as outside her area of expertise and not consistent with the cleared intelligence picture. Did you engage with the substance of her analysis? A pause. Not sufficiently, sir. Did you ask the S2 officer to review her terrain assessment against the available imagery? Another pause longer. No, sir. Why not? The longest pause yet. Elena watched his jaw work. She watched him make the decision that she understood from the outside was the hardest kind, the decision to tell the exact truth when the exact truth revealed something about yourself that you would have preferred not to reveal in front of witnesses. Because I had already made up my mind about the source, he said, and I let that affect my assessment of the information. The room was absolutely still. Vasquez said, "Clarify what you mean by the source, Captain." He finally looked at Elena. It was a brief look, a few seconds, and she could not read all of what was in it. There was too much layered in there, too many things competing for space. But somewhere in the stack of it was something that looked through all the complexity like a man confronting a mirror he had been avoiding. "Sergeant Cruz," he said to the panel. I had already formed an opinion about Sergeant Cruz that affected how I received information from her. He paused. That was a command error. It was my command error. Price wrote something in her notebook. After Oakes left the room, the panel took a 20-minute recess. Elena sat with Tran in a corridor that smelled like coffee and recycled air and said nothing. Tran reviewed her notes. Elena looked at the wall. "He told the truth," Elena said finally. "Yes," Tran said. "That took something." "Yes," Tran said again. She looked up from her notes. "How are you feeling about how this is going?" Elena considered. "I don't know how to read it yet." "That's because it's genuinely unresolved. This panel has real latitude here." Tran paused. "But Price has been writing consistently every time something goes in your favor and stopping every time something doesn't. I've been watching her." Elena filed that away. When the proceeding resumed, Hargrove called one final witness. Elena had not known he was coming. She had not been told, and Tran, who had known for 2 hours, had made a deliberate decision not to tell her because she wanted Elena's reaction to be unmanaged and authentic, which Tran understood from long experience was more persuasive to review panels than any prepared response. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes walked through the door and sat down across the table, and Elena kept her face still through an act of will that cost her more than anything else in that room. Barnes had brought a folder. He set it on the table and folded his hands on top of it and looked at the panel with the unhurried authority of a man who had 38 years of decisions behind him and was comfortable with the weight of all of them. Hargrove said, "Colonel Barnes, you've submitted a written assessment for the record. Would you characterize that assessment for the panel?" "I would," Barnes said. "My assessment is that Sergeant Elena Cruz demonstrated in Carsa Basin a level of tactical intelligence terrain analysis capability and precision marksmanship under fire that exceeds any formal qualification standard in her current MOS and meets or exceeds the qualification standard for Special Operations Forces sniper designation." He opened the folder. "I've attached a comparative analysis prepared by the Regimental Scout Sniper Platoon Commander who reviewed the ammunition log and the S2's retroactive position assessment and who characterized the engagement as his words textbook multi-position interdiction conducted with professional-grade shot discipline and target priority sequencing." He closed the folder. "I've also attached a formal statement from Corporal Marcus Reyes, who directly observed Sergeant Cruz in position and in operation, and whose characterization of what he witnessed I will not attempt to summarize, because his words are better than anything I would substitute for them." Vasquez said, "Colonel Barnes, Sergeant Cruz disobeyed a direct order from her commanding officer, departed her post without authorization, and conducted combat operations without qualification or authorization. In your assessment, how should this board weigh those facts against the outcome?" Barnes looked at Vasquez steadily. "I think the board should weigh those facts with the full seriousness they deserve," he said. "I also think the board should weigh the fact that the outcome of her disobedience was the survival of 447 Marines. And I think the board should weigh the fact that the chain of command she disobeyed had access to the same information she had and chose not to act on it." He paused. "In 38 years, I have sat in rooms like this one more times than I can count. And I have learned one thing about these proceedings that I believe more firmly than almost anything else. The question of whether someone broke the rules matters less than the question of why. And the question of why matters less than the question of what it cost and what it saved and whether the people in the room have the honesty to look at both sides of that ledger at the same time." He looked at Elena when he said the last sentence. Just briefly. Just enough. The panel retired to deliberate at 14:20. Elena and Tran sat in the corridor again. An hour passed, then 90 minutes. Tran got coffee. Elena didn't want any. The bass sounds moved around them, engines' voices, the rhythms of an installation that existed regardless of what was happening in the room 30 feet away. Holloway appeared at the end of the corridor at the 90-minute mark. He wasn't supposed to be there. He stood at the far end with his hands in his pockets and looked at Elena, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the looking didn't already cover. At 16:40, the door opened, and Hargrove asked them back in. Elena sat down. She put both hands flat on the table the way she always did when she needed to feel something solid beneath her. Hargrove looked at his paper, then at her. This panel has reviewed the full record of the events of Carsa Basin and the 9 days subsequent, including all testimony, written assessments, intelligence analyses, medical and operational reports, and supplementary materials submitted by the parties and witnesses. He paused. We have reached a determination. The room had the quality of held breath. This panel finds that Sergeant Cruz's departure from assigned post and unauthorized engagement of enemy forces constitutes a violation of applicable regulations and orders. That finding is entered into the record. He looked up. This panel further finds that the circumstances of that violation, including the demonstrated inadequacy of the intelligence assessment underlying the convoy authorization, the documented failure to communicate a material intelligence gap to the convoy commander, and the documented dismissal of a valid terrain analysis without substantive engagement constitute significant mitigating factors that this panel is required by regulation to weigh. Elena did not move. This panel therefore recommends that no court-martial proceeding be initiated, that the charge sheet be formally withdrawn, and that Sergeant Cruz's service record be amended to reflect the supplementary materials entered into evidence today. Hargrove set the paper down. This panel further recommends by unanimous vote that Sergeant Cruz be formally evaluated for MOS reclassification consideration, including but not limited to designation as a candidate for scout sniper training through the appropriate formal qualification program. The word unanimous reached her like something physical. She absorbed it. She did not let her face change. She pressed her hands flat against the table and breathed in exactly the way she had learned on the Eastern Ridge, half a breath and hold, let it out slow. Tran put her pen down with a small, controlled click. Price closed her notebook. Vasquez looked at Elena across the table with an expression that was the closest thing to warmth. The Inspector General's office apparently permitted informal proceedings. Sergeant Cruz, she said, do you have anything you'd like to say for the record? Elena thought about it. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the maps. She thought about Delgado and the 6 months she had spent building a ghillie suit she had always known she would need. She thought about Corporal Reyes climbing a ridge to put the truth on record, and Barnes making a second phone call, and Holloway standing at the end of the corridor with his hands in his pockets. She thought about the 2 Marines who had not come home. Yes, ma'am, she said. 2 members of this battalion died in Carsa Basin. I want that to be the last thing said in this room because everything else we've discussed today, everything this panel has determined, and everything it has recommended, none of it changes that. Those 2 Marines had families, and they should have come home, and they didn't. She paused. I'm grateful for what this panel has decided, and I will carry those 2 names for the rest of my career. They don't cancel each other out. Vasquez held her gaze for a long moment. Noted for the record, she said quietly. The proceeding was formally closed at 17:03. Elena walked out into the late afternoon heat and stood outside the building and didn't move for almost a full minute. The bass was shifting into its evening rhythms around her, the pace slowing slightly, the quality of light changing, the sound softening at the edges. Tran came out behind her and stood beside her without speaking. Then Holloway came around the corner of the building at something close to a jog, which was not a thing Sergeant First Class Danny Holloway did unless something had happened or was about to. He stopped in front of Elena and looked at her face and read it, and whatever he read there made his jaw go tight and his eyes bright in the way that happened when he was working hard not to show something. Well, he said, charges withdrawn, she said. MOS reclassification evaluation recommended. He put both hands over his face. Not dramatically, just briefly, just for a second, in the uncalculated, unmanaged way that a person puts their hands over their face when they have been holding something very tightly for a very long time and have just been told they can set it down. Then he dropped his hands and looked at her. Scout sniper evaluation. That's what they said. He laughed. It was a short sound, sharp and genuine and slightly wet at the edges. 7 years, he said. 7 years, she agreed. They stood in the evening heat, the three of them, and the base moved around them, and somewhere inside the headquarters building, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes was reading a determination that confirmed what he had believed since the first day he had read a communications gap report, and understood that the person who wrote it was seeing things other people weren't looking for. And somewhere in this same installation, in whatever room he was living inside his own reckoning, Captain Derek Oakes was sitting with a truth about himself that no review board could adjudicate, and no charge sheet could capture the specific truth of a man who had looked at another person and decided she was a radio girl, and had then watched her save nearly 500 lives with 31 rounds and a map that had been available to everyone. That truth was his to carry. Elena didn't want it. She had enough of her own. What she wanted, what she was beginning, cautiously and with the discipline she applied to everything to let herself believe might actually be coming, was the thing Barnes had said in his office 9 days ago, in the tone of a man making a decision he'd already made. Stop wasting you. She breathed in the evening air. She stood straight. She did not look back at the building behind her or forward at anything specific on the horizon. She simply stood in the present moment of a base in the high desert on the 9th day after a valley had tried to swallow 480 people whole, and she let herself feel carefully and without excess exactly as much as the moment deserved. It was enough. For right now, it was exactly enough. The formal notification arrived 3 weeks after the review board on a Tuesday morning that felt like every other Tuesday morning at Faux Alvarado Valley Flat, light, dry heat, the smell of diesel and dust that Elena had stopped noticing sometime in her second week at the base. She was running radio checks in the comms tent when Holloway pushed through the flap and set an envelope on the table beside her equipment without saying a word. He stood back. He crossed his arms. He watched her face. She finished the radio check. She logged the frequency confirmation. Then she picked up the envelope. It had the regimental seal on the front and her full name and rank typed cleanly below it. Sergeant Elena M. Cruz. The M stood for Maria, which was her grandmother's name, which she had always kept as the middle initial rather than the first name, because she had made that decision at age 18 as an act of privacy she had never fully explained to anyone. She opened it. She read the first paragraph, then the second. Then she set it down on the table and looked at the radio equipment in front of her and didn't say anything for a long moment. Well, Holloway said, Scout Sniper Basic Course, she said. Reporting date is in 31 days, Stone Bay. He let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for 3 weeks. Stone Bay, he repeated. That's the real one. That's not a supplementary program or a trial evaluation. That's the actual course. I know what Stone Bay is, Danny. He smiled. It was a full smile and managed the kind he almost never showed in professional settings. Yeah, you do, he paused. How do you feel? She thought about the question. She thought about how to answer it honestly without answering it in a way that sounded like she was performing a feeling for an audience. She turned the envelope over in her hands. Like I've been running toward a door for 7 years and someone finally opened it. She paused. And like I'm aware that walking through it is going to be harder than everything that came before. You've never backed down from hard. No, she said, but I've also never had this much to lose before. That was the thing she had been carrying since the review board determination, the thing she hadn't fully articulated even to herself until just now. For 7 years, she had operated without formal recognition, which meant she had also operated without formal stakes. If she failed at something nobody believed she could do, the failure cost her nothing she hadn't already been denied. But now there was a letter with a reporting date and a regimental seal, and the stakes had changed in the specific way that stakes change when someone finally acknowledges that you are worth betting on. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in her left breast pocket against the same side of her chest where she kept the grease pencil notebook she had used on the Eastern Ridge. 31 days, she said. Plenty of time to get ready. I've been ready for 7 years. He laughed again, shorter this time, and she realized she had said it without any bitterness at all, which surprised her. It was just the truth stated cleanly. 7 years of preparation that no one had authorized and no one had credited, and that had nonetheless accumulated into 31 rounds and 14 positions and 447 people breathing. She went back to her radio check. Holloway stood there another moment, and she could feel him wanting to say something more, something that matched the size of the moment. She appreciated that he ultimately decided not to. Some moments were big enough on their own without additional words. The letter moved through the base faster than she had expected. She had not told anyone except Holloway, but by afternoon the news had covered the distance from the comms tent to the motor pool to the mess hall to the squad bays in the specific way that news moves through a military installation, not through official channels, but through the invisible network of people who talk to people who know people, a chain that operates faster and with more accuracy than most formal communication systems. Corporal Saez found her after evening chow. He came alone without the easy pack energy that young Marines usually carried around each other in groups. He was carrying himself differently than he had in the days immediately after the basin, or even the day he had climbed the ridge to talk to her. He had grown something in the weeks since Karsa. Not older exactly, more settled. Like a young tree after its first serious storm, the roots had gone deeper. I heard, he said, news travels. Stone Bay, he said. My uncle went through Stone Bay. He said it's the hardest thing he ever did. What does he do now? He's a gunnery sergeant at 29 Palms, scout sniper. Been doing it for 12 years. She nodded. He made it through. He also said the first week they run out about 40% of the class. I know the attrition numbers. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I just wanted to say before you go that what you did in that basin matters to me. Not just because I was in the convoy, but because I've been in this corps for 2 years and I've watched a lot of things happen that I couldn't name or fix or argue against. In Karsa Basin it was the first time I saw what it looks like when someone refuses to let the thing that's wrong keep being wrong. He paused. I needed to see that. I think I needed to see that before I got any further into this. She looked at him. 22 years old from Phoenix, with his jaw set and his eyes clear and his hands completely still at his sides. She thought about the convoy frequency and his voice cutting through the chaos, young and calm, and asking where to look. She thought about him climbing the ridge with his rifle slung because he had needed to see the thing with his own eyes before he could believe it. You're going to be good at this, Reyes, she said. He blinked. At what? At this, the job, the whole thing. She said it simply without elaboration because she meant it simply. Some people had what it took and some people didn't, and it wasn't always the people the institution chose to invest in first. He straightened slightly, not a formal posture, just the posture of someone who had been handed a weight they were willing to carry. Thank you, Sergeant. She nodded once and he walked away, and she watched him go and felt something settle in her chest that she identified as the particular satisfaction of a debt correctly paid. 3 days before her departure date, Captain Oakes requested a meeting. Tran advised her she had no obligation to attend. Elena told Tran she wanted to attend, and Tran gave her a long look that contained several things, and then said she would be available by phone if needed. They met in a small room off the headquarters building that was used for individual counseling sessions and had 2 chairs and a small table and no windows. Oakes was already seated when she came in. He stood when she entered, which was the second time in her experience a superior officer had stood for her, and the second time it had surprised her. She sat down. He sat down. He had his hands folded on the table and he was looking at them rather than at her. He looked like a man who had rehearsed a speech and then at the last moment had decided to throw it away. I'm not going to apologize, he said, because I think an apology from me right now is something you haven't asked for and probably don't need. He looked up. But I need to say something, and I need to say it to your face, not to a review board panel or a report or any other intermediary. She waited. I had the same maps you had, he said. I had the same information, and I chose not to look at it seriously because of who was bringing it to me, not because of the information itself. He paused. 2 of my Marines died in that basin. 2. And the number could have been 280, and you are the only reason it wasn't. He stopped. Started again. I have been doing this for 17 years. I have never had a subordinate save my convoy from a decision I made wrong. I have certainly never had a subordinate I dismissed as not worth listening to turn out to be the most consequential person in the entire operation. He looked at her steadily. I don't know how to hold all of that yet, but I know I need to be honest about it. She looked at him across the table. She thought about the briefing room and his hand flat on the table and the way the other men had laughed. She thought about what it had cost him to say what he had just said, not to a panel with a legal obligation to record it, but here in a room with no witnesses to her face. I know you don't know how to hold it yet, she said. That's honest, and I respect it. She paused. I also need you to know something. I didn't go up that ridge to prove you wrong. I went up that ridge because 480 people were going to dig, and I was the only one who could stop it. She held his gaze. The fact that you were wrong is incidental to why I did what I did. I need you to understand the difference. He absorbed that. Does that distinction matter to you? It matters because if I had done it to prove something, I would have made different choices. I might have identified myself on the radio when you asked. I might have come down off that ridge differently. She shook her head. None of that was the point. The point was the convoy. He was quiet for a long time. That's a hard way to operate, he said finally, doing the right thing when it gets you nothing. It got me Stone Bay, she said. Something moved across his face. Not a smile. Something quieter and more complicated. Yeah, he said, it did. He unfolded his hands and set them flat on the table the way she had done in the review board room, pressing them against something solid. For what it's worth, Cruz and I understand if it's worth very little, I think the Corps is going to find out what kind of sniper you are, and I think it's going to be a surprise to everyone except the people who've been paying attention. She stood. He stood. She rendered a salute, and he returned it without hesitation. Cleanly the way a salute is supposed to be returned, and she walked out of the room and down the corridor and back into the heat of the base, and she did not look back. The morning she departed, FOB, Alvarado Valley Holloway drove her to the transit point in a vehicle he had borrowed from the motor pool without filing a request, which was the kind of small rule he was willing to bend when the occasion warranted it. They drove in comfortable silence for most of the trip, the way people drive, who have said most of the important things already and are content to let the road carry the rest. 3 kilometers from the transit point, he said, I want to say something before you go, and I don't want you to argue with me. Okay. You are the best Marine I have ever served with. I have served with a lot of Marines. That is not a close competition. She looked at the road ahead. Danny, I said don't argue. She didn't argue. I'm going to put in for a transfer to the sniper support element at Pendleton in about 6 months, he said, by which time you'll have finished the course and received your MOS designation, and I would like to be in the same unit as you for at least 1 rotation before one of us retires. That's a personal goal I'm setting. She looked at him. You'd transfer for that? I've transferred for worse reasons. She turned back to the road and didn't say anything for a moment, because the thing rising in her chest needed a moment to stabilize before she tried to speak around it. You're a good man, Danny Holloway, she said. I know, he said, without any modesty, which was exactly the right response. He pulled up at the transit point, and she got out and shouldered her gear. He stood by the vehicle. They looked at each other across the roof of the truck in the early morning light. Stone Bay is going to try to break you, he said. It can try. He nodded. Go be what you are, he said. Make them see it. She turned and walked toward the transit building, and she did not look back, and he did not call after her because they were both people who understood that the looking back was unnecessary when the forward direction was clear. Stone Bay was everything Reyes's uncle had promised and several things he had not mentioned. The Marine Corps Scout Sniper Basic Course was 10 weeks of physical and psychological pressure, applied with a specific methodical intent of determining which candidates were made of something that held under compression and which were made of something that came apart. The first week removed 38% of the class. Elena was not among the 38%. The instructors were not gentle with her. They were not gentle with anyone, but they applied to her a particular scrutiny that she recognized from 7 years of practice. The extra layer of attention given to someone, the institution is watching testing, trying to find the boundary of. She found the boundary of nothing. She worked through every test and every exercise and every evaluation with the same coiled patience she had been building since the first day a superior officer had looked through her like she was made of smoke. She was the only woman in the class. She was aware of it every day and spent approximately 0 energy on it, which turned out to be the correct strategy because the instructors and classmates who were going to respect her were going to do so based on performance, and the ones who weren't were going to find their position untenable in the face of her sustained and undeniable excellence. By the fourth week, she had the highest field evaluation scores in the class. By the sixth week, the primary instructor, a master sergeant named Calloway, who had 16 years in the Scout sniper community, and the face of a man who had seen every kind of weather from the outside, stopped applying the extra scrutiny. Not because he had become less demanding, because there was nothing left to scrutinize in the direction he had been looking. He told her this directly, which was more than she had expected. He pulled her aside after a field evaluation where she had ranged and engaged 7 targets in a complex environment at distances between 300 and 580 meters, achieving first-round hits on 6 of 7 and a second-round correction on the 7th, that he later described in his notes as a textbook win read under time pressure. "Cruz," he said, "Master Sergeant, where did you learn to read wind like that?" "A sergeant named Delgado, 3 years ago at Pendleton." "Delgado." He said the name with the recognition of someone who had crossed paths with it before. "He's still over there." "He retired 18 months ago, Master Sergeant." Calloway nodded slowly. "He teach you the pocket." She looked at him. The pocket, the place between heartbeats where the crosshairs stop moving. Delgado's word, his concept, his specific vocabulary for something that most instructors describe differently or not at all. "Yes, Master Sergeant." "He taught me the same thing," Calloway said, 12 years ago. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully categorize. "You've been in the pocket your whole career, haven't you? Not just shooting, everything." She thought about 7 years of swallowing rooms that went quiet. 7 years of patience that was not passive but coiled. 7 years of waiting for the moment she had always known was coming. "Yes, Master Sergeant," she said. "Something like that." He nodded once and walked away, and never treated her differently from any other candidate in the class again, which was the best thing he could have done for her, and she understood that he knew it. She graduated from the Scout Sniper Basic course on a Friday morning, in a ceremony that was not elaborate because the course was not about elaboration. Diplomas were not handed out. MOS designations were recorded in personnel files by people in offices who dealt in paperwork. What the graduates received at the end of the final formation was a small metal insignia, a crossed rifle's emblem that had no particular ceremonial weight attached to its presentation. Just a handshake from the course commander and a place in a formation of people who had gotten through something most people don't. When the course commander reached Elena, he shook her hand and held it for an additional half-second and said quietly, "Barnes called me before the course started, told me what you did in Carsa Basin." He paused. "I didn't tell my instructors. I wanted the course to evaluate you clean." She looked at him. "What did Barnes say?" He said, and I am quoting directly, "Don't waste her." He released her hand. "We didn't." She stood in the formation with her new MOS designation recorded in a file somewhere, and the crossed rifle's insignia in her hand, and the specific bone-deep exhaustion of 10 weeks of sustained pressure finally releasing its hold. And she felt for the first time since the morning she had walked through the wire at FOB Alvarado Valley, with dust on her boots and a map tucked in her left boot, that the things she had always known about herself had been confirmed by the world outside herself in a way that could not be taken back. The phone call from Holloway came that evening. He asked how she felt. She told him she felt like herself, which was the most accurate thing she could say. He laughed and told her he had submitted his transfer request, and she told him she had not forgotten that he said he would. He told her Barnes had sent a message through the battalion network, one line that Tran had forwarded to her personnel file. She asked what it said. He read it. "Sergeant Cruz has demonstrated that preparation precision and the refusal to accept institutional failure as inevitable are not deficiencies in need of correction. They are assets in need of investment." She sat with that for a long moment. "Good line," she said. "He's a good man," Holloway said. "Yeah, he is." They talked for a few more minutes about logistics and timelines and the transfer process, and then Holloway said he needed to go, and she said she knew, and they said goodbye with the ease of people who understand that goodbyes between them are temporary and operational, not permanent. She set the phone down. She sat in the quiet of the barracks room she would occupy for 2 more days before reporting to her new assignment. She thought about the Eastern Ridge and the Limestone Depression and the 31 rounds lined up in rows beside her right hand, each one a decision made in the pocket between heartbeats. She thought about Corporal Reyes' voice on the convoy frequency, young and clear, and asking where to look. She thought about her mother's voice saying, "You are still standing," confirming something she had always known. She thought about the two Marines who had not come home from Carsa Basin. She thought about them by name because she had learned their names in the first days after the operation and had kept them the way she kept everything important, without ceremony, without performance, but with the steady and permanent attention of someone who understands the difference between remembering and simply not forgetting. Lance Corporal James Tate, 20 years old from Knoxville, Tennessee. Corporal Aaron Webb, 24 years old from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She would carry those names into every field, every range, every mission that came after this. Not as weight, as purpose. She opened her personnel file on the laptop beside her and looked at the updated MOS designation. Military Occupational Specialty, 0317, Scout Sniper, 7 years after she had first walked into a training program and been quietly removed from the roster without explanation. 7 years of accumulation of patience that was never passive, of knowing without external confirmation, of holding the pocket when the world around her was trying to convince her there was no pocket to hold. The Marine Corps Scout Sniper, who nobody had believed in, had become herself, not despite the institution's resistance, but through it, shaped by every dismissal and every room that went quiet, and every superior who had looked through her like she was made of smoke, shaped into something harder and more precise and more certain than she would have been if the road had been easy. She closed the laptop. She lay back on the rack and looked at the ceiling and breathed in the same deliberate way she had breathed on the Eastern Ridge, half in, hold out, slow. And she understood with the clarity that only comes to people who have paid full price for the things they know, that this was not the end of something difficult. It was the beginning of something she had always been built for. Elena Cruz had waited 7 years for the world to catch up to what she already knew about herself. She had used that time to become unbeatable to work. And now, with 31 rounds in an ammunition log and a designation she had earned in the only way that meant anything, by proving it under fire alone on a ridge nobody sent her to, she was exactly where she had always been heading, and she was ready for every single thing that came next.